During World War II, American soldiers entered a world where survival depended not only on strength or firepower, but on the ability to outthink an enemy who had built an entire empire on discipline, deception, and ruthless efficiency. Before you dive deeper into this story about the hidden tricks, psychological maneuvers, and clever technologies the U.S. military used to outsmart their opponents, make sure to subscribe and leave a like. It motivates us to keep producing deep, cinematic analyses like this one. What follows is not the official, polished narrative of textbooks, but a more intimate, atmospheric reconstruction of the methods, tools, and illusions that American troops employed when the battle lines blurred, when intelligence mattered more than bullets, and when the smallest trick could turn the tide of a thousand-mile campaign. Many people imagine the American soldier of World War II as a straightforward fighter, a man with a rifle and a uniform, young, brave, and determined. But the truth is far stranger. Beneath the surface of conventional warfare lay a shadow world of improvisation and cunning, where deception became a survival instinct, and where creativity was sometimes more lethal than a high-caliber round. For the soldiers landing in North Africa, Italy, the Pacific, France, or the frozen forests of the Ardennes, one universal lesson became clear. The enemy wasn't just watching, he was studying. And in this surveillance-heavy battlefield, Americans responded with their own quiet revolution of misdirection. Some of the earliest innovations came from necessity. Soldiers realized that Germans and Japanese forces were trained to react predictably to specific stimuli: engine sounds, troop movements, artillery preparation, radio transmissions. So the Americans began to manipulate those stimuli. They used fake radio chatter to fabricate entire divisions where none existed. Operators imitated accents, slang, and even the pacing of real commanders so convincingly that enemy intelligence agents wrote reports about phantom units moving through territories where not a single boot had touched the ground. What was even more astonishing was how low-tech much of this deception was. A single radio jeep, hidden behind a hill, broadcasting intermittent chatter between fictional officers, could convince the enemy that 20,000 men were assembling for an offensive that in the European theater. The mastery of trickery evolved into an art form with the formation of the Ghost Army, a unit whose mission was to wage a war without bullets. These soldiers were artists, designers, sound engineers, theater set builders, men who knew how to create illusions so convincing that German reconnaissance planes photographed them and reported back to Berlin that new armored divisions were arriving at the front. Inflatable tanks, rubber aircraft, plywood cannons, and carefully spaced fake tire tracks turned empty fields into what looked like bustling invasion staging zones. At night, truck convoys with massive loudspeakers blasted recordings of tank engines, shouted commands, clanking metal treads, and hundreds of idling vehicles. To a German listening post 2 miles away, it sounded like an entire corps preparing for assault. Yet if one had walked into those fields at dawn, he would have found nothing but air-filled shapes billowing slightly in the morning breeze. But deception didn't belong solely to specialized units. Regular infantrymen, tank crews, medics, and scouts adopted their own clever habits, simple, almost primitive tactics that nonetheless saved countless lives. Soldiers sometimes scattered empty ration cans tied with string in dense jungle terrain so that approaching enemy patrols would stumble into the rattling traps and reveal their positions. In the Pacific campaigns, where Japanese forces relied heavily on night infiltration, Americans developed a system of deceptive fire. They deliberately placed foxholes and machine gun nests where they would not fire at approaching enemy troops, giving the illusion of weak points. Only when the Japanese soldiers broke stealth and attempted to exploit the perceived opening would the hidden positions engage in devastating crossfire. It was intellect weaponized, a trap set by minds trying to stay one step ahead in an environment where miscalculation meant death. One of the most quietly powerful tools American soldiers used to outsmart the enemy was the art of camouflage. Not simply wearing patterned uniforms, but reimagining their surroundings as a stage on which survival required performance. Soldiers disguised themselves as farmers, fishermen, or refugees in occupied territories to gather intelligence. In the Pacific, scouts learned to blend into vegetation so effectively that Japanese patrols sometimes walked within a meter of them without noticing. Snipers draped themselves in ghillie suits woven from local plants. Some even pinned live insects and leaves to their outfits so that small natural movements would appear authentic. A sniper who remained invisible wasn't just avoiding danger. He was manipulating the enemy's perception of the battlefield, making them feel watched, hunted, uncertain. Psychological warfare grew more important as the conflict intensified. American forces dropped leaflets written in fluent German or Japanese, using cultural nuances to sow doubt, confusion, and fear. Some leaflets imitated official enemy documents, warning troops that their leaders were hiding casualties, withholding supplies, or abandoning entire divisions. Others advised soldiers to surrender, claiming, sometimes truthfully, sometimes not, that their commanding officers had fled or that reinforcements had been destroyed. This soft, paper-thin method of deception was surprisingly effective. Frontline units reported numerous surrenders after major leaflet drops. But the real brilliance lay in timing. Leaflets appeared after intense bombardments or sudden flanking maneuvers, making the psychological blow coincide with physical shock. Another unusual trick involved American engineers modifying equipment to create misleading impressions. Tank units sometimes welded spare metal plates in strange, asymmetrical shapes to mimic different tank models and trick enemy observers into misidentifying their vehicles. Aircraft crews painted fake squadron markings or nose art to confuse Axis intelligence reports tracking air group movements. Even boots became tools of misdirection. During certain operations, soldiers wore reverse boot soles, designed so that footprints pointed opposite the true direction of movement. This was particularly effective in desert and snow operations, where armies often tracked opponents by analyzing footprints. Radio operators, arguably the invisible architects of deception, developed an entire subculture of mental warfare. They mastered vocal mimicry, linguistic quirks, and the improvisational skill to hold conversations in the persona of an enemy commander they had never met. Captured signals were studied like psychological profiles to reproduce tone, impatience, radio discipline, the rhythm of breathing between sentences. A single forged message, transmitted at the right moment, could reroute an enemy battalion, cancel an artillery barrage, or cause an entire regiment to retreat from a battle that never existed. Some operators even learned to imitate the subtle crackle patterns of specific enemy radio equipment, creating the sonic fingerprint that made their transmissions believable. But cunning extended beyond technology and tactics. It became part of the soldier's instinct. Troops would intentionally leave behind misleading items when retreating. Maps showing fake supply routes, diaries describing fictional troop shortages, staged photographs of non-existent divisions. German and Japanese interrogators spent hours analyzing these accidental discoveries, unaware that the facts they uncovered were planted breadcrumbs. During reconnaissance in France, American scouts planted empty cigarette packs labeled with rare U.S. brands that weren't actually distributed to frontline units. Spies who acquired them reported that elite American divisions were operating in areas where in reality only small reconnaissance teams were present. The soldiers' creativity blossomed, not in luxury, but in desperation. When low on supplies, troops sometimes carved silhouettes of men out of wood and placed them on ridgelines at dusk so that enemy snipers wasted ammunition shooting at soldiers who were nothing more than cleverly shaped shadows. Marine units on Pacific Islands used mirrors and broken radio parts to create flickering glints among trees, convincing Japanese observers that snipers were aiming at them from multiple angles. Sometimes deception was as simple as mimicking the sound of footsteps using rocks and helmets, tricking enemy units into believing they were surrounded by a much larger force. Though outsmarting the enemy often evokes images of battlefield trickery, some of the most profound American advantages came from understanding the psychology of fear, isolation, and uncertainty. Soldiers spread rumors deliberately, knowing the enemy monitored civilian radio or intercepted local gossip. They staged accidental conversations in cafes in liberated towns, speaking just loud enough that collaborators could overhear false plans and relay them to German officers. These controlled whispers shaped enemy expectations more effectively than any formal announcement. Even medical units joined the silent war of deception. In one instance, American medics intentionally displayed exaggerated casualty numbers on supply forms, knowing the documents might be captured. The goal was to convince the enemy that U.S. forces were weakened before an upcoming offensive, a tactic that worked so well that German troops delayed their counterattack by 2 critical days. Meanwhile, real American units quietly maneuvered into position that on the naval front. American sailors used their own brand of creative trickery. Destroyers emitted false sonar pings to imitate submarines, causing enemy fleets to waste torpedoes. Submarines released chemical canisters that produced bubbles resembling periscope wakes, luring enemy ships away from convoys. Some vessels mounted decoy antennas or painted deceptive stripes to confuse rangefinders. Aircraft carriers even trained pilots to imitate the flight patterns of different nations' aircraft so that enemy spotters misidentified the origin and size of air groups. One of the most audacious tricks came during the run-up to D-Day. American intelligence teams created entire fake meteorological stations and transmitted bogus weather data, ensuring German forecasters predicted storms in the Channel. These manipulated forecasts convinced Hitler's commanders that an invasion was impossible. Many high-ranking officers went on leave, including Erwin Rommel, who famously left the front to celebrate his wife's birthday, precisely because American deception had tilted the mental battlefield. Throughout the war, American soldiers also relied on intuition, improvisation, and a kind of battlefield creativity that no manual could teach. They learned to read enemy habits, the hours they smoked, the times they cleaned weapons, the rhythm of guard rotations. Scouts crawled close to enemy lines and imitated birds or animals to test whether sentries reacted consistently. Snipers sometimes tossed stones into bushes to provoke enemy marksmen into revealing their positions. Ordinary infantrymen, often no older than 22, became masters of subtle observation, capable of dissecting enemy behavior with a level of precision that rivaled trained psychologists. But perhaps the greatest trick American soldiers used wasn't a gadget, a sound effect, or a decoy. It was unpredictability. Unlike the rigid Axis military doctrines that followed exact procedures and punishments for deviation, American units were encouraged to adapt, improvise, and innovate. If a plan failed, soldiers were expected to find another way. This cultural flexibility made American deception difficult for the enemy to anticipate. A German officer could study U.S. manuals, interrogate prisoners, and analyze intercepted communications, yet he could never fully predict how an American platoon might behave under fire. They might charge bravely when logic dictated retreat, fall back strategically when the enemy expected an attack, or split into small, fluid units that defied traditional military structure. Deception became a mindset rather than a tactic that by the end of World War II, American cleverness had reshaped the very meaning of warfare. The soldiers discovered that the battlefield wasn't only a place of guns and trenches, but a landscape of perception, a psychological arena where illusions, rumors, sounds, and shadows could be as lethal as any bomb. They learned that misleading the enemy wasn't dishonorable. It was essential to survival. And through their improvisations, whether inflating rubber tanks or whispering false plans in a crowded tavern, they helped secure victory not just by overpowering their adversaries, but by outthinking them at every turn. The legacy of these deceptive tactics lived on long after the war ended. Many of the techniques developed by American soldiers became foundations for modern psychological operations, military camouflage, electronic warfare, and intelligence work. But in the quiet, unrecorded moments, a soldier tying rattling cans to a tree branch, a radio operator imitating a German colonel, a scout hiding motionless under jungle leaves, one can sense the real heart of these innovations. They were created by young men who refused to be mere targets on a battlefield. They sought to shape the enemy's expectations, to twist the narrative of the war itself, to survive through cleverness when brute force was not enough. In the end, the story of how American soldiers outsmarted their opponents is not a tale of arrogance or superiority, but of creativity born from fear, necessity, and the instincts of human beings fighting to stay alive. It is a story of illusions crafted in the smoke of battle, of tricks whispered in the dark, of minds working in overdrive while the world around them burned. It is a reminder that wars are fought not only with steel and fire, but with imagination, the most unpredictable weapon of all.